Here is Colorverse Adobe, a beautiful golden yellow that looks much darker in the swatch than in the writing sample, but it does stay readable in the writing sample. Now, this gives a super consistent tone as paper changes, making it very predictable. It also shades really well all of the time. Yes, this does perform well on non-fountain pen friendly paper, making it good for students and others that use the more inexpensive papers more often. I have this in a second color on the page for myself. I would find a whole page of this just a little bit of straining on the eyes, but I would enjoy the heck out of a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here against this bright white Clairfontaine paper, we see a readable yellow that really looks fantastic. Golden yellow on the page. No feather, no spread, no question at all about the shading. Just look at how question shades quite a bit. And as a word, in general, it's a whole lot darker than assigned that's underneath it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Rainy Day. Here is Colorverse Filicette. Here is Colorverse Office Blue Black. Here is Colorverse Office Brown.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we see the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just more of the lighter tones, but they're all still there. I guess if you wanted, you could call it generally lighter as a tone, but I'm going to call it the same just because of the range of shading, or maybe to be confusing, call it slightly lighter. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It still does shade, though nowhere near as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade nowhere near as well as the Clairfontaine, but it still does shade. You can find it generally. For the most part, you're going to see a lot of the lighter tones, though. Now, I don't know if I got a feeling this is being affected by the tone of the page, showing less of the shading, more of the lighter tones because of this paper, meaning I think this is a little bit more translucent in ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get to see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as on the Clairfontaine. Most importantly, I don't think this stands out against the quad rule with it's burying itself underneath it. This, I don't think, is a great ink to use as a primary ink on this paper. It becomes visually confusing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more yellow inks.
Here is Califolio Bouton d'Or. Here is Diamine Golden Sands. Here is Geherban Amber de Bermini. Here is Krishna Danu Udak.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get to see the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just a whole lot more of the lighter tones. No feather, no spread, barely any shading, almost always giving us the lighter tones that we saw on the Clairfontaine. It's not duller, it's just there. It's not standing out against the quad rule. I don't think this is a good color for students to use unless it's just as a second color, drawing kind of the afterthought to the notes on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Califolio Equinox.
Here is Noodler's Bernanke Red.
Here is Van Diemen's Hanging Lake. Here is Noodler's Kiowa Pecan.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just the lightest tone that we were really getting from the Clairfontaine on a huge majority of the writing. Now, we get no feathering. We get the occasional spot of some shading. This is very bright on the paper. I don't think this would be horrible to use. I just don't think this would be the best to use. But if all you're trying to do is draw attention to a spot in a nice, gentle way, this could be a huge alternative to red ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, only a couple spots that it gets a little deeper into the paper. This could be an amazing ink to use if you have to go make marks on both sides of the paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pilot Vanishing Point Medium Nib is a medium to dry flow writer and gives a very usable yellow with very nice consistent shading. Off camera, I tried this in a very wet fine, and it darkened and shaded even more. So while I like it from the medium flow medium, I loved it from the wet fine. That makes the wet fine my recommendation for this great shading, readable yellow.